Good morning and welcome to Driving Force Radio, where we seek to discover what drives today's leaders. It's almost inconceivable that there was a time not so long ago that terrorism was a faraway threat, something that happened only in the movies or in foreign countries. But since September 11th, it's become an American reality, a concern at least in the back of our minds each time we board a plane or go to a major sporting event. For some reason, even the everyday concern is prevalent. Is it realistic or is it paranoia? Today we're talking with Melanie Pearlman, the Executive Director of the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, the CEL for short. Welcome to the show, Melanie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We are so happy to have you here, and I know such a lot of the backstory of the CEL. But tell listeners, what does the CEL do? What's the mission? Why are you here?
Well, thank you for asking and thank you for having me. The CEL stands for the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab. And we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan center that seeks to educate individuals and organizations on the realities of today's threats and how people can get engaged to prevent them.
So when you say it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, what does that mean? Are you lobbying? What exactly do you do?
No, that's an excellent question. We do not lobby. What we do is we educate people through, we have a number of avenues in which we educate people on. One is our exhibit. We have a state-of-the-art multimedia facility in Denver, Colorado, and it's a 7,000 square foot experience in which the visitor gets to really understand the many facets that affect our national security that are part and parcel of understanding the threat of terrorism.
You know, Melanie, we were talking about what the CEL does, but I really want to frame up how the CEL got started.
The CEL got started by one of the most incredible visionaries. His name is Larry Meisel. And after 9/11, the attacks on 9/11 profoundly affected him in such a way that he really felt compelled to try and address this subject matter, terrorism, the threat of terrorism in our nation, and to help our government ultimately mitigate this threat.
Well, and the interesting thing about Larry, too, is that he's a businessman.
Right. So Larry is a unbelievable visionary, not only through his philanthropic activities. Right. He's the international chairman of the board of the Simon Wiesenthal Center Museum of Tolerance. And he saw how extraordinary, how powerful the Museum of Tolerance was in dealing with a very dark subject matter, such as the Holocaust. And creating an education forum for people to understand how this cannot ever happen again through tolerance, through education, through awareness. So he really felt compelled to create another exhibit, another museum, another center to address this particular subject matter. Larry, in his day-to-day operations, is a home builder for Richmond American Homes. He's the president and founder of Richmond American Homes. But he does so many extraordinary philanthropic activities, and this is one of them, but really is his passion, and really feels that this is where he can make a profound, significant impact in certainly helping our government.
Well, and two, it was started sort of in response to 9/11 and to create this, how can I help? What can I do?
Right.
But I know, too, on the 10th anniversary of September 11th, that you guys created one of the most amazing events anywhere in the country in remembrance of 9/11. Tell us about that.
So the 10th anniversary of 9/11 was so significant, and we really wanted to create a remembrance ceremony on the lives that were lost and the many people and military servicemen and women and first responders that have been affected over the years by virtue of that. And we wanted to create a way in which we paid tribute to them. We brought 22 pieces of World Trade Center steel from New York to Denver. And we created a very significant ceremony around those particular pieces. And thanks to you, you were very helpful in helping us transport that steel. And what we did was we partnered with the Denver Post, 9 News, to the National Guard, all of the first responders, the senators, Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar, the mayor, Mayor Hancock, Governor Hickenlooper, along with all of the other facets in our community, the Colorado Children's Chorale, the Colorado Symphony, the Beach Boys. And what we created was not only a remembrance ceremony where there was a firing gun salute, there was a flyover, there was interfaith representatives that gave prayers, the dignitaries paid tribute, but what was the most significant was also celebrating America's will to prevail. And that was significant. And the Beach Boys were the perfect Americana band to talk to really the fact that our troops, our first responders, and all of our citizens that have helped us in this fight help us prevail.
And it was such a fantastic day, and there were tens of thousands of people in Civic Center Park. And like I said, it was one of the nation's preeminent remembrances and celebrations on 9/11 right here in our local community. And it was a fantastic day.
Thank you.
It was absolutely fantastic.
Partners.
And I know that to build that, to do the work that the cell does, that you guys engage so many folks who are working in the communities to combat global terrorism. Can you talk a little bit about some of those collaborations and how the cell sort of came to be?
Sure. One of the things that we recognized very quickly was that we needed thought leaders on both sides of the aisle, from think tanks, incredibly reputable think tanks, and government officials that are vested in the subject matter on a day-to-day basis, to help inform the content that's in the exhibit and help actually inform the programs in which we do, as well as some of the training initiatives. And in so doing, we were able to collaborate with Department of Homeland Security both on a local level as well as on a national level. We're able to collaborate with think tanks such as RAND, Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, and a number of others, a litany of fabulous institutions that have really helped us informing what the content is. And then with respect to our training initiatives, we really partner with community preparedness groups such as the Colorado Emergency Preparedness Partnership Group, such as our Homeland Security's fusion centers here, the Colorado Information Analysis Center, and other law enforcement organizations, and really to help educate the community.
So you talked about an exhibit in this 7,000 square foot space, and the building is absolutely beautiful. Tell the listener a little bit about the exhibit and what you're trying to convey. What's the messaging?
So that's an excellent question. The exhibit is a 7,000 square foot facility in which people walk into an experience to start to understand the definition of terrorism, the fact that there is no universally accepted definition throughout the world and in our country, and the implications of that. Then it goes into the evolution of terrorism. The history of terrorism talks about what the current threats that exist. We explore the types of tools, the types of weapons that terrorists use, from traditional weapons such as AK-47s and grenades and bombs, but also the common everyday elements that that terrorists have used, such as cell phones, such as computers, and so that's pretty extraordinary. The other thing that we really address is the debate between civil liberties and security that our nation, as well as other countries, continue to have by virtue of the national security threats in which we face, and how best to balance our civil liberties with our security. One of the other most compelling sections is how terrorists have exploited the media, and how that evolution of how they've exploited the media over time through using the internet for recruitment and training purposes has significant implications on how our country and other countries try and thwart that threat. The last but most important center is really a training facility to educate citizens on what they can do about it, on recognizing suspicious activity, understanding who they can call and when to call them.
Well, and that's a piece I want to ask a question on, because as I did the research on the cell, there are several media outlets that say that the exhibit tries to scare citizens. And when I saw the cell, I did not see it that way. So what would you say to that? How are you trying to create empowerment through the exhibit?
Well, that's an excellent question. The exhibit does not try and scare citizens, but what it does do, it gives you a very realistic experience of what terrorist incidents have looked like. And we don't shy away from that because terrorism is a real threat, and the atrocities and devastation that it has had on many countries, including ours, across the world, is something that we should always remember and always think about in understanding that it's important to continually educate ourselves on what the current threats are and what we can do about it to mitigate the possibility of that ever happening again.
Well, and I want to come back to something. Tell us a little bit about the definition of terrorism, because I think so many people only put one and one together to equal two when it's the definition of terrorism, and that is full frontal attack on something. And I know there are so many other kinds of terrorism. Give us some examples and tell us a little bit about the definition, if you will.
That's an excellent question. And as I said before, there's no universally accepted definition. But what our country has adopted, and I can't tell you verbatim because each particular department has its own definition. Sure. The distinction between terror and terrorism is that when people go in and commit acts of terror, sometimes they actually have a political motivation or an ideological motivation in which they're creating these atrocities. And in that particular instance, that is an act of terrorism. When it is an act of terror and not terrorism is when people go in there for no other cause but to create awful atrocities. Does that make sense?
Okay, so it's distinct, but it's a very fine line between what terror and terrorism really is. And I know that you guys create at the cell some really interesting and informational programming around these very topics. And what's so great about it is that it's free to the public.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the reasoning for the public events that you guys create at the cell.
So one of the things that we recognized was the exhibit in and of itself is a starting point for people's understanding about the threat of terrorism and what they can do. In order to keep them engaged, in order for them to continue to understand how this threat is evolving, we decided to put on a programming series on a quarterly basis in which we bring in the foremost thought leaders that are actually debating specific issues that are being thought through in Washington, D.C. throughout our nation. So, for instance, homegrown terrorism has been an unfortunate trend. Mm-hmm. We brought in Secretary Ridge, the former Department of Homeland Security Secretary, to talk about that respective evolving threat. We had a debate on how our country treats international terrorism suspects and what the implications are in shutting down Guantanamo and trying particular terrorism suspects in respective cities and actually having those individuals in prisons throughout the country. We moved on to different types of forums that really address the more global issues, such as the implications of our withdrawal in Iraq and Afghanistan, and whether or not that might potentially be creating a safe haven for terrorist organizations to start targeting the homeland, and what our country is doing about it.
Well, and I know the last one that you guys hosted was titled Emerging Threats to U.S. National Security, from Iran to Global Terrorism. What's next? I mean, that one was amazing, and it was some of the foremost leaders.
Right.
And the beauty of your programming is it's not just government officials, and it's not just, but it really runs the gamut from public to private organizations, as well as military officials and those folks who really touch all the different pieces and components of it. So talk about that one a little bit and what's coming up next.
Sure. So the last one we hosted with Senator Udall, and one of the things that we wanted to bring together was a panel that had different perspectives on the issues of our global security and national security. So we had the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that could give a Department of Defense or a military perspective on what the implications are happening globally and what are happening nationally. We had a former Homeland Security advisor under the Bush administration, Ken Weinstein, who could really talk about the national security issues that are evolving today. We had Senator Udall, who could give us the policy perspective, and then we had the former ambassador to Iraq and North Korea, Christopher Hill, moderate that particular panel, who can give us certainly the global perspective on the implications of what the United States is doing. So that in and of itself was fascinating. What we're going to go to next is more about what's happening specifically on the homeland, and really focusing on what citizens and communities can do in partnering with the government and partnering with the private sector in help mitigating that threat. We have Secretary Chertoff lined up, and we're putting together a couple of other guests that will be up on a panel and on a forum to really engage in this particular type of conversation. One of the other significant topics that everybody raises, be it from a national perspective or in an international perspective, is cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is such a difficult and sensitive subject matter to private corporations, to individuals, and to countries. And it affects commerce, it affects infrastructure, it affects our lives on a real, regular basis, and it is becoming much more of a threat that our nation and other nations are recognizing they have to address in a serious way. And the only way they can address it is to partner with businesses, partner with social organizations, and partner with citizens to start understanding where those threats are coming from and how we can best mitigate those threats.
Well, and you're listening to Driving Force Radio, and we're talking to the executive director of the cell, Melanie Pearlman, and we're talking about current terrorist threats. We're talking about what the cell is doing to get the information out, to share information with folks around the country about terrorism and counterterrorism issues, and some of the collaborations that have gone on. And you just brought up a really interesting topic around cyber terrorism, and it's huge. And I don't know if you can speak to this, but can you just give a little bit of a framework about the impact that cyber terrorism really puts on our own homeland?
Yes, I can. I can give you a very high level understanding. Yeah. There are so many things in which our country and our communities are reliant upon with respect to computers and transaction, from commerce to infrastructure to trade, that if any one of those things is targeted by a particular organization who wants to conduct harm, it could have significant implications on our financial services sector. It could have significant implications to our transportation sector and to our water, to you name it. Everything that is in operations now somehow tangentially is tied to computers, and is tied to the internet, and is tied to the worldwide internet, which is fantastic in how much and how much that it has excelled our ability to operate more efficiently. But it also creates some significant vulnerabilities for people in which want to do harm to us. And one of the things, or one of the unfortunate trends that some government institutions have put out there, is understanding that the terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda want to hurt us in multiple ways. Not just, unfortunately, in lives lost, but what is called death by 1,000 cuts. And part of their, the fear is, or part of that understanding is that those 1,000 cuts can really speak to cybersecurity, that they can ultimately exploit, shutting down some significant systems within our country that can create such havoc and distress, and that it is becoming a very real and serious issue.
Well, and you talked too about that you guys are fully engaged with our military here in the United States as well, because they do bring so much
Yes.
expertise. They're on the front lines, on the ground, but it's more than that. They too are really looking at these cyber issues, everything from the way they deliver fuel and everything from transportation
Exactly.
to just their communications, because so many things of the military are based here in the U.S. and Canada, but really work the things that are on the other side of the world.
Right.
And so how are you engaging with the military? Because that seems like such a foreign concept, I think, with people, because they seem a bit untouchable.
That's an excellent question. The military is very vested in national security issues and partnerships with private entities by virtue of this particular threat. And so NORAD and NORTHCOM, for instance, and our National Guard have been very engaged in addressing this in a real way. We don't have a formal partnership with them, but what we do is we put on some forums in which we invite members of the community to actually engage with the military, and specifically what it is they're doing and how the partnerships can be more beneficial in helping them understand how to secure our homeland.
I just love that. So obviously it's public-private partnerships, but I know that the work of the cell really fits into the current Department of Homeland Security initiatives as well. Tell listeners how you're working with Homeland Security initiatives and what you guys are doing proactively to address things.
Great. We have what is called the Community Awareness Program. And the Community Awareness Program is a free program that educates citizens on what suspicious behavior looks like and how to report it and who to report it to. And the Department of Homeland Security rolled out a campaign a couple of years ago called the See Something, Say Something campaign that really speaks to the Community Awareness Program. And what we did was we partnered with Department of Homeland Security and FEMA on a national level to create a 4-hour training program for citizens to understand what that threat looks like, how to address real suspicious activities in your community when you see somebody surveying a target, when you're walking down a street and you might happen to witness somebody trying to steal a uniform, that a police officer would use, or so on and so forth. Those are obviously criminal activities, or some are criminal activities, but those are potential things that people can witness that would be very helpful for law enforcement to know, and the law enforcement then can deem whether or not that was actually a criminal activity. All of these things ultimately help thwart attacks. For instance, the best case example in recent years has been the New York Times Square vendor, who actually saw a smoking vehicle and reported it to the authorities, and ultimately led to thwarting a significant attack.
Absolutely. It was in the middle of Times Square.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I am going to share one of my personal stories. We work here in the transportation industry, and so many of the big national attacks are done on public transportation, aircraft, freeway systems, those kinds of things, in big trucks and trains and airplanes. And I got a call one day from a gentleman who said, I want to charter a ship, and I want to fill it with fertilizer, and I want to bring it through the port of Long Beach, and then I want to put it in a warehouse, and then I want to rent 150 trucks to move it across the country. Well, who are you? And he wouldn't tell me. And then I said, well, where do you want to go with this? And I'm like, Long Beach is not the right place for you to go, to go through Houston, where they deal with this kind of equipment. He's like, nope, it needs to be in Long Beach. Long Beach being one of our busiest ports for international commerce.
Right.
It was like, this just isn't sounding right. And so at that point, I hang up the phone. I take the gentleman's name. I hang up the phone, and I'm like, who do we call?
Right.
And so this is where somebody can learn where they need to go and how to do things, and take something that just doesn't sound quite right and do something with it. Yes?
That's exactly it. And one of the key partners that we developed this in conjunction with is called the Colorado Information Analysis Center. And it is a fusion center that really understands how to thwart threats, how to identify threats, and then actually how to relay that particular information to the respective agencies that will deal with that in a very real-time situation. And it is a Department of Homeland Security endeavor that has all of our respective law enforcement, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, sitting in the kayak to analyze that information. And so engaging with the community and actually having you call them can then start a process in which they can see if this is a credible threat or if this is just work as usual.
Right. Well, I know we have to go to break here, but when we come back with Melanie, we're going to learn more about the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, the CEL. You can learn more at thecel.org. And we'll be talking more about the CAP program and the community awareness programs, as well as some of the other fantastic things that the CEL is doing. Come right back. Welcome back to Driving Force Radio, where we seek to discover what drives today's leaders. Today we're joined by Melanie Pearlman, the Executive Director of the CEL, based here in Denver. And the CEL is such a unique organization. It's everything between museums and events and exhibits and trainings to really engage the community in this larger conversation around terrorism and counterterrorism, and what you can do about it, where you're not the victim of it, but where you can engage and get real credible information around it. Yes, Melanie?
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
And I've got to say thank you so much for coming today and for sharing the story of the CEL. And before we went to break, we were talking about the program, the CAP program, and it's a community initiative that you guys are out there doing, and it's recent startup. And it's really to bring awareness and curriculum that helps citizens recognize terrorist and criminal activity. Tell a little bit more about that and who the collaborative partners are.
That'd be great.
And is it only in Denver?
That's an excellent question. We started the community awareness program after our success in collaborating with Department of Homeland Security and our state's Fusion Center in creating a video called Recognizing 8 Signs of Terrorism. And we had John Elway and Kim Christensen, a local news anchor, narrate this video. And it really is a 4 to 5 minute, very quick video on what suspicious activity looks like and how and who and where to call if you should witness that. One of the things Department of Homeland Security asked was for us to create an educational, interactive program where law enforcement can go into their communities and teach citizens. So it solidifies or complements the existing relationship that they already have. And we collaborated with the Colorado State Patrol, with the FEMA, with Department of Homeland Security, with Urban Area Security Initiative, with Aurora Police Department, with Colorado Department of Public Safety, across the board to create a consistent message in which we're educating the public on what suspicious activity looks like and who to report it to, so people don't get confused.
Sure.
And it was a wonderful collaborative effort, and what has happened thus far is we've had it in our pilot phases. We've trained over 70 terrorism liaison officers.
Wow.
Throughout the state of Colorado, and we've educated over 600 people in the three very short months this has happened. We're going to roll it out on a statewide and a national basis, and we're collaborating with the International Association of the Chiefs of Police, who are planning on helping us roll it out to every state across the country who wants it. And what it does is it actually works within the constructs the Department of Homeland Security has put forth for these law enforcements to engage the community. The communities are citizens. Everyday citizens help law enforcement critically. They are the ones who are actually on the front lines. They are 90% of the time, they are the first responders to an incident that has happened first. And to help educate them on what specifically they should look for, how they should report a specific incident, and who to call has significant implications on helping get the right information to law enforcement.
So it's not just about law enforcement or those first responders. It's about those folks that are running their neighborhood watch programs.
That's exactly it.
Those stay-at-home moms who are really kind of watching their communities while kids are in school and folks are out working. It's really all kinds of folks, right?
Everybody. And the more people are educated, the more our communities are safer.
So what is the criteria for participation?
There is no criteria. If you want to enlist and enroll in a community awareness program, you're more than welcome to do so.
So as I was talking about and creating the show over the last couple of days, there are so many people that don't really recognize the terror threat issues domestically. You hear the sound bites on the news about foreign threat, but you don't really hear it about here. So how are you engaging people and sharing the message with a relatively unengaged audience, or to those who purposely avoid the topic?
Right. No, that's an excellent question. Unfortunately, one of the trends that our country has seen is homegrown terrorism. And what that is individuals who are persuaded by a particular ideology to create an unfortunate terrorist incident that is happening. So it's our citizens in particular that are actually creating a threat to our country and to our homeland. And one of the things that this particular program does, the community awareness program, is talks to what it is you're recognizing in people's behavior. So you're not racially profiling, you're behaviorally profiling, and that in and of itself is significant, and it doesn't infringe upon civil liberties and security in so doing. One of the things that we recognized is the Timothy McVeighs, the Unabomber. They are foreign threats. They were domestic threats, and those domestic threats still exist today as well. And so the FBI and our law enforcement is just as concerned about those lone wolf, what is termed lone wolf individuals that are operating on their own for their own respective reasons, as they are from an international threat.
Well, and with some recently here in the Colorado area as well as here in the Rockies, there have been some fairly high profile folks that have been caught here locally, and everybody from Zazie to Jamie Ramirez over in Grand Junction.
Right.
Should the average citizen be paranoid of homegrown terrorism and or terror?
Nobody should ever be paranoid, but what they should be is educated and understanding what is an actual threat and what to do about it, and continuing to create awareness within their communities, and that helps mitigate the threat. The fact of the matter is the percentage of actual attacks is low. When they actually happen, though, it is devastating. And for all of us to be engaged in this issue will help secure and make sure that our communities are safer.
And so it's not always about being scared. It's not about a scary thing. Because I think maybe, and this is my own opinion on this, I think maybe you sort of shut that out because everything is so atrocious when you see it in mass media. Right. But it's not really necessarily, it doesn't have to be that way. Am I hearing you correctly on that?
It's about knowledge. It's about knowledge and awareness. That the threat of terrorism is a reality. And we're not shying away from that by any stretch of the imagination. But the way that terrorists win is for you to curb your normal everyday activities. The most resilient communities that have faced terror attacks over time have succeeded against terrorism by virtue of the fact that their societies aren't paranoid, but they know what to look for, how to be educated, and how to continue to engage in this.
Absolutely. So I want to bring it back to travel. Travel is one of those things that we hear about so much, and there are so many regulations now around travel. Can you frame some of that up a little bit? What's going on with that, and share some of your war stories, if you will?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Look, I mean, one of the questions is, how has terrorism affected me, right?
Right. Absolutely.
And every person who goes to an airport has to go through a whole security procedure. And that is the first, I would say, best example of how terrorism has affected you. That our country is taking the necessary measures in order for us to be able to travel from place to place. On the one hand. On the other hand, it is an inconvenience. We don't like taking off our shoes or belts, putting our laptops in the conveyor belt and so on and so forth. But at the same point in time, it is absolutely critical. And it's interesting because different countries have different security measures.
Absolutely.
I was in Israel a number of years ago and looked and actually experienced the unbelievable measures in which they went in order to make sure that I wasn't a threat. It was interesting. I had changed my ticket a day or two before, and I was wearing an Israeli Defense Force t-shirt and trying to check my luggage in, because in Israel you have to check your luggage in before you can actually get your ticket to go to the airplane. And in so doing, I had 3 officers actually continue to question me on various aspects of why it was I was there, where it was that I was going, what if I was Jewish, what synagogue I went to, what are the holidays, and so on and so forth. And I was a bit flustered, obviously, sure, because you had these very intimidating officers interrogating you. And it was right before I started this job. And what was so fantastic, what was so coincidental about it was I had just bought a new computer, and I had all of these, the business plan and all of these visuals, graphic visuals of what the cell was about to undertake. And so the only material that was on the computer was about terrorism. And
oh my gosh.
So needless to say, I missed the plane, and I was there for about another 3 hours before they let me go and realized that I wasn't a threat whatsoever. But as inconvenient as it is and as it was, it is understandable.
Absolutely.
But one of the most, I think, profound experiences that I had was when I first started this job, I went to Washington, D.C., and I was in the cab line, and I started to engage in a conversation with this person behind me. And he said, "What is it that you do?" Eventually, I got to, I'm just starting this center called the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, and I explained what the whole impetus was. And he turned white, and he looked at me, and he stared. And he said, "Melanie, my name is David Beamer. My son was Todd Beamer, the passenger on United Flight 93 that said, 'Let's roll.'"
Oh my gosh.
And what you're doing is so important, because people think of 9/11 as an event in and of itself, and that it couldn't happen. And I go around the country educating people that unfortunately this is a very real threat, that 9/11 was a significant event in our history that has changed the face of our national security.
Right, right.
And he talked about the importance of continuing to bring this to the forefront of people's minds on a daily basis. That we can't just think it happened then and it's not going to happen to us.
Sure, sure. And we're seeing it everywhere.
Legacy.
I mean, that's amazing to me. What's the likelihood of that?
It was unbelievable.
And I bet just life-changing for you.
Extremely so.
Yeah.
And it continues to bring it back to what the import of why we do, what we do.
Absolutely. But it brings back that bigger question about the World Trade Centers and 9/11 just in general. And if this is too sensitive a question, you don't have to answer it, but I have to ask, how did you get the World Trade Center steel? How did you go figure out how to get it here?
We went through a significant process of applying for this respective steel. And ultimately what it came down to was talking about the import of the cell and talking about the import of our great organization and its mission in creating a memorial to the worldwide victims of terrorism, and specifically a 9/11 memorial that we're working on in conjunction with the city of Denver here. And when the judge magistrate ultimately approved our application to secure that steel from the Port Authority of New York, we were able to send a team of 12 of us to go out and walk through the 2 hangars of steel in which were stored from 9/11. And so the first thing in which you saw when you walked in was a bike rack with bikes that were there from 9/11 and mangled and crushed. And then you looked at the lines of steel that they had painstakingly put together and identified as many pieces as to where they were in the North Tower, the South Tower. It was significant, and you were able to walk through this room, and they had this separate division, the separate room that had all of the emergency vehicles that were incinerated, crushed, mangled by the metal. You looked at the foundation beams that the steel incurred from the crash and the heat and the pressure that went on. We walked into another room that had the subway trains that were actually under the trade towers when the planes hit, and one of them had a Wimbledon poster and I think it was like September 14th or 15th, and it was so eerie because it brought you back to that day.
Sure.
And you saw people's glasses, you saw people's shoes, you saw there was a Warner Brothers store at the World Trade Towers, and you know that sign that's so famous, "That's all, folks"?
Yeah.
So you saw that sign, "That's all, folks," and it charred down the center. It was the distinction between pure evil meets pure innocence in that sign, that embodiment of what the cartoon was all about. It was
absolutely
awful. It was so heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
And it was so extraordinary. And one of the curators brought us to this mangled piece of debris. And he said, "This is one of the most sensitive pieces that we have in here." And it begged the question, why?
What is it?
People felt that it was a piece of debris that was mangled particles, mangled pieces of steel that they thought was from the top 5 floors of one of the towers. And people really felt that their family members, that was their burial ground, was in this debris. And it was so jarring.
Yeah.
After we were able to identify the 22 pieces of steel, the Port Authority had agreed to not only give us steel, but also other educational institutions and law enforcement and military facilities across the country. We had to transport that steel. And in so doing, when we transported it here to Colorado, the Colorado National Guard, as well as 20 different law enforcement agencies throughout the state of Colorado, gave them a police escort of that steel to various locations throughout the state. And one of the most profound experiences that I had in this job was riding in that motorcade along Colfax from Buckley Air Force Base into the city of Denver and watching people line the streets and have a flag out and clutch their heart in so doing.
Yeah. And then I remember when my children saw that steel for the first time. My grandson cried, and he was a baby. He was an infant when it happened. My little one, you had guard members out there guarding the steel as it was out there on display in front of the city and county building. And my younger daughter, she asked me, "Mommy, I don't understand." But she took flowers up, and by the end of it, she understood. And she understood the trauma of it. I have to ask, have you been to the new World Trade Centers?
I have.
And I know I got to go last year to the new World Trade Centers and to the memorial. It too is extremely moving, and I give great honor to those gentlemen and women who are rebuilding that spot, and that nothing can take us down. I have great admiration for those folks who work there every day.
It's sacred.
It is sacred, and they recognize it.
Very much so.
And they're amazing human beings. I don't know if I could do it every day.
No, it serves as a reminder of a terrible, terrible event.
Those were tough times.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other things that we had the opportunity to do was actually talk to people that were in the World Trade Towers. And we videotaped, we had, I think, 5 or 6 interviews of different individuals, from one of the firefighters to an individual that was on the 90th floor of one of the towers. And he conveys the story of actually being there, of trying to open the door and watching the woman's restroom door blow out with bellows of smoke, getting very scared, and finding other people in which were there. And they called down to the first responders and they said, "You need to get us, we're trapped on the 90th floor. And they said, the first response, they said, "Don't worry, we're coming up to get you." Mm-hmm. And they were able to look out the window and they saw the tower fall. They saw that tower fall. And they said, "We're not waiting anymore." And there was one stairwell in which they were able to escape through. And he was one of very few people from that height that actually survived. Wow. And it was, he talks about the glass and the blood. And I mean, he actually saw somebody die in his hands. I mean, it brings it back.
Is the steel at the cell at this point?
So in our redesign, we've incorporated a whole section on 9/11 and a huge piece of steel within the exhibit. The other pieces of steel are right now are under development for a memorial at Bobby R. Park, which is a park that the city of Denver owns, and we're doing a joint project. Our larger entity is called the Meisel Museum, and they're really spearheading building this memorial for 9/11 in Bobby R. Park, which is going to be absolutely extraordinary. Mm-hmm. So,
well, I respect the work you do. Thank you for doing it. It's amazing what you do. Check out thecell.org and learn about these homegrown terrorism issues. Learn about our foreign terrorism issues. Certainly get engaged. Yes?
Absolutely.
Yeah, get engaged in your communities. And if you have the chance, I know we were so honored to participate with you on the World Trade Center stuff and on some of the things that you do from an event perspective. It was life-changing for us and for every truck driver and forklift driver and crane driver. It was amazing for us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing it to our communities and sharing the information and the knowledge and the wisdom with us.
Thank you.
We appreciate it very, very much. Melanie, what's next at the Cell? What's the new undertaking? Sure. Where are you headed?
That's a wonderful question. We are excited that we're redesigning the exhibit to address a number of the realities that exist today, in the headline news, in the threats. And we've really transformed the exhibit into a training facility so people actually go through and understand all of the different facets we just touched upon, but walk away empowered, walk away engaged. We're really looking forward to partnering with the International Association of the Chiefs of Police, possibly along with other national organizations, and rolling out the community awareness program to be a nation, to be this nation's model in community engagement with respect to the subject matter.
What's the timing on that?
No, that's a really wonderful question. We're working that out right now. I'm going back to DC next week to discuss what the timeline is and how that looks.
Okay.
So.
And what's the next event? Those free events, I will tell you, always really get my mind going and thought processes going, and trying for me to understand, as a business professional in the Denver market and a suburban mom, what does it mean to me? And every time I go to these events, I learn so much, and I learn so much about this global policy, and that we are not just this country in and of ourselves, that we really are part of this very large global picture. What's up in that arena?
The next event is really going to focus in on cybersecurity and the implications to our national security. Secretary Chertoff is part of a group that really explores this issue in depth. And it's being debated now in Washington, D.C. on particular pieces of legislation that will have significant impact on the resources that our country will have to combat that particular threat. And so Secretary Chertoff has agreed to participate on a forum with us, which we're very excited. Yeah. and we're putting together some more panelists or experts that can really speak to that subject.
And what's the timing for that one?
That'll be in July.
In July. Okay. Melanie, where can listeners learn more about the work of the cell and everything that's going on?
At www.thecell.org. Well,
Melanie, I can't thank you enough for being here. We love working with you. We love being community partners with you here at ICOSA. And as Melanie said, to learn more about the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, visit the Cell's website at thecell.org. Thanks so much for joining us today. Tune in every week for Driving Force Radio to learn what's driving today's leaders. I'm Jan Mazotti. Thanks so much for listening.